The first Gulf War and the second Gulf War are so critical in creating the Osama bin Laden phenomena. Right? Osama bin Laden, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, came back to the Saudis and said, I will guarantee Saudi security. I will call all of my supporters and volunteers and those who went to the Afghan jihad, and we will confront, right, the Iraqis. We will confront Saddam Hussein. Now, the Saudis, at least they looked at him and said, nah, we don't think that this is a possibility. So they actually went ahead, and possibly the U.S. had a role of exaggerating Iraq's threat because the U.S. wanted to get in there for its own purposes. The Saudis sided with inviting the U.S. troops in. That launches the change in Osama bin Laden's logic or thinking process by saying that the presence of U.S. troops on Saudi Arabia is a major violation of Islam, and the U.S. troops have to be removed from the holy sites. Now remember, the U.S. has been in Saudi Arabia since the Second World War. The U.S. has been in Saudi Arabia. Not in the numbers that we had post-1990-91, but the U.S. had standing bases for a long period of time. Because Saudi Arabia is our second pillar of our foreign policy, and we had vested. Now, the difference is post the first Gulf War, we have 500,000, so it's at least becomes very large. But for a long period of time, the U.S. was there. Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait made it possible for us to go closer into the oil reserves and the oil deposit, and that set bin Laden in confronting the Saudi family first, and then the U.S. second. Now, post the first Gulf War, by the time we get into the later 90s, he begins to target the U.S. first, thinking that it's much better to go to the base of support for the royal family as a way of undermining the royal family. And you could, analyze his strategic logic, but I think his strategic logic is valid in terms of what he thinks, is that rather than going after the Saudi royal family, go to their protectors, or what he thinks is the blanket of security that is provided to the Saudis. And if you can target the blanket of security to remove it, then the Saudi royal family will be weakened, thus enabling Osama bin Laden and his supporters to gain control of Saudi Arabia and what he considered to be the religious sites. I looked at possibly more detail than at this point relative to the oil and God. Now let me jump a little bit now to the oil aspect once again. We consume about 20 million barrels a day of oil in this country. More than China and Europe combined. China is about 4.5, they're getting closer to 5 million barrels. Europe is about 4.2, and possibly 5 million barrels. So we consume twice as much as China and Europe combined in terms of oil. Every day, the world consumption of oil is about 80 million barrels. Every day. By 2030, we need about 100 to 120 million barrels of oil per day. The largest oil reserve present in the world, even though that we are seeing that there is a diminishment, is still the Middle East. The largest oil reserve, readily documented, and it's readily available, close to the surface, cost of production is easy, and so on, is there. We want access to oil at a cheap price. It's not only access, but we want it to have a particular price. Now, the price right now is very problematic for us and very problematic for the global economic structure. Even though that it's not allowed to go up relative to inflation, we need it to continue to be in a particular margin. Second is that we want to have total control of oil vis-a-vis our competitors. We want to have total control of oil vis-a-vis our competitors. Our main competitors are Europe and China. Our main competitors in the global market is Europe and China. Both don't have oil resources, and they are dependent, once again, on oil from the Middle East and other regions. That's why if you look at some of the moves of the Chinese in Africa, you just have to look at oil. And some of their moves in Latin America has to do with oil and Central America, they know the political game, the strategic political game. Not only we want to have access to our oil, but we want to control access of our competitors. Our biggest competitor, China and Europe. And our biggest financiers are Europe and China as well. Because for many of us, we don't know that we are in debt. Not only our households, but our country as a whole is in debt. It's closing, I think we're closing to $2 to $3 trillion. I think $3 trillion in debt. Now, who buys that debt? Who is financing that debt? Who is providing us the credit card, right, to be up in there and just charge as much? China and Europe. Now, in here, you need to speak about strategic positioning. At one point, the Chinese want to get their money back. And the Europeans want their money back. Then you have to have some negotiating chips that are sitting on the table in a poker game. The Chinese, at the end of the day, want Taiwan. That's what they're looking at. And they would like to get it without having to fire a bullet. And my bet so far is that they will get it without having to fire a bullet. Because at one point, the negotiating, would you like to reschedule your debt, or would you like to have this island called Taiwan to be the center part of your foreign policy objective in the China Sea? I think the United States will act rationally and say, we would look the other way, and you could incorporate Taiwan. It's Chinese anyway, and you already have our manufacturing base. What would a small island do for us strategically? With ballistic missiles that you could have them here in Berkeley shooting out, and they will hit China before they could actually get up for breakfast. And so the strategic value of Taiwan is no longer there. So our hand on the oil in the Middle East has to do not only of our use, because we only use about 25% of Middle East oil, it's the use of the oil by other countries who are our competitors that we are looking at for the foreseeable future. Any rational person would realize that Iraq did not have weapons of mass destruction, unless you were reading certain articles in this country that were produced by people who wanted to have the operation. A country that has been in 20 years in war, a ragtag army, was built as a threat to us, that they're going to come into New York with one drone plane and threaten New York. A country that did not have an air force. A country that did not have a navy. A country that barely had replacement parts for its own weaponry that they bought from the Russians 20 years ago. The only way for us to think about it is in relations to the oil and wanting to have a strategic hold of the oil. If you look at some of the documents they've written, they want to prevent a Sino-Islamic alliance. This is what I consider part of the new construction of Islamophobia. That we are going to Iraq to prevent a Sino-Islamic alliance. The Muslim world has the oil, Sino in relations to China. So we want to prevent a Chinese-Islamic alliance. So the way to do it is for us to sit on the oil to prevent this from taking place. Sino-Islamic alliance. Right? And I hear say that both the yellow threat and the green threat has been merged together, right, for Halliburton and Chevron and the oil companies as a way of trying to position themselves relative to the Middle Eastern oil. And long and behold, that Afghanistan also have some natural gas interests, because we wanted to have a pipeline that comes out from Afghanistan all the way to the Indian Ocean to pump out the natural gas that Afghanistan has.